Hello, my name is Aaron Dobbs, and I will be presenting Chapter 11 from Rory's Anthology on the History of American Public Schools. And this chapter is specifically written by Rory, and it's called Race and the Politics of Chicago's Public Schools, Benjamin Willis, and the Tragedy of Urban Education. As such, from this title, it's somewhat obvious that the thrust of Rory's argument throughout this chapter is that the superintendent of Chicago Public Schools from 1953 to 1966, Benjamin Willis, was massively instrumental in the decay, unfortunately, of Chicago Public Schools. So there's three major ideas, and these three things are summed up throughout much of the chapter. And the first is that Rory looks to historicize what happens to Chicago Public Schools. How do we go from a period which they are praised the beginning of, or the latter end of the middle of the 20th century, right before the 1950s, in that little beginning period? How do we go from an era where they're praised for accommodating tons of students to falling apart? And again, much of his argument hinges upon Benjamin Coppage Willis and this belief that he has, this ethos that we should keep the school district separate from politics. And this keeps, what it does is it kind of isolates the school district from the progress that's going on with civil rights in the United States. And as such, what it means is that the Chicago Public District is going to be falling apart for the most part because there's very few small white schools that get tons of attention, privilege, and funding, up to 133% of their black counterpart, versus black schools that fall behind. And the term that Rory uses to talk about this conscious isolation of urban schools is called spatial differentiation, and that certain schools will be selected based on power and privilege for the purposes of racial segregation. The other thing that happens here is because of spatial differentiation and because of Willis's failure to act, segregation apologists basically come out of the woodwork and find themselves in a system that is amenable to their ideas. Willis largely promotes the idea of neighborhood schools, and these are schools that, for the most part, are protected from desegregation through the racist dog whistle of, well, we just need to cater to this specific population in this small area in this very, very, very specific locale. What that does eventually is it basically just breaks down desegregation initiatives, and then eventually when those do come through, it promotes white flight. So, the purpose of this chapter, put succinctly from Rory's own words, what educational policies changed in Chicago Public Schools, what took Chicago Public Schools from being some of the top across the nation for public schools to falling to the very bottom by the time the Reagan administration was in power. How did Chicago go from one of the most rewarded school districts to one of the worst? And again, Rory's argument is that Benjamin Willis sets forth this policy of willful ignorance that basically creates a system that can be abused to keep school desegregation efforts on the back burner. And as these things are not coming to fruition, as people like the Urban League, the NAACP, the Chicago Public Defender continually make the public aware rather, black schools are not getting the same resources as white schools. And this divide that begins due to spatial differentiation and, hey, let's all just have neighborhood schools, becomes much more accelerated over the course of time. So again, there's this process of change that happens, and Rory argues Willis's refusal to consider desegregation efforts encourage resistance to change in public schools in white neighborhoods. So white neighborhoods do not integrate, and black schools begin to fall behind. So let's talk about this idea, spatial differentiation and the effect of Willis's legacy. So his era largely can be characterized by this term, and really what Rory's getting at is that we have two diverging communities, and the rift is just being exacerbated. And again, this is based on power and privilege, and the delta between the haves and the have-nots is growing because one specific group is getting more resources, largely based on race. Those would be the white schools. And unfortunately, the black schools, or urban schools, begin to fall behind. And we see this decay. It's kind of a feedback loop because you have less funding and less personnel. And with less resources and more burdens, these two things, they have an inverse relationship, and it actually makes things worse very, very quickly between, having personnel and, or not having personnel and having to meet very high standards. Unfortunately, then white students flee. We see a big push for white schools to stay white, to stay neighborhood schools. And this really sets up this whole white flight problem that begins to really take off in the 1960s. So it's also important to state that Chicago was not always in a state of decline. A big part of Rory's argument is that this actually got much worse because of Willis, and that Chicago as a school district relative to other school districts was doing a better job than most when it came to accommodating its massively diverse population. Class sizes were limited. There weren't enough personnel who were specialized. The 1950s is seen as this golden age. Early 1950s, then we have the Willis administration. Things are good for a little bit, but by the end of the 1950s, it's clear that that golden age is over. So Benjamin Coppedge Willis, again, this gentleman that largely forms the entire thrust of Rory's argument, was the superintendent of the Chicago Public Schools, and he thought that educational leaders need to be authoritative, but he also thought, with some degree of cognitive dissonance, that despite them being authoritative, they were really not supposed to go into politics, and it was not their business to use the education system or even consider politics within the education system, especially something like civil rights or desegregation. Rory thinks that that whole ethos was basically taken, appropriated, and then used to exploit basically rationales for opposing desegregation, to keep white schools separate from black schools. All right, so again, spatial differentiation is this idea that there will be clear winners and losers in the distribution of social resources. We have two tiers, good schools versus bad schools, and that there's supposed to be different poles or extremes on the opposite side of the spectrum. Well, what happens is one school is going to get a lot of resources, the other school is not, and what that means is that there will be population displacement. And the specific population in this case was white people voluntarily left and took resources with them. And this is why we have white flights, urbanization, and then those schools that that pop up, they try to keep homogeneously white to try and avoid any of the things that they thought they did not like with integration. And again, all of these processes really just continue to exacerbate this divide between the two tiers of schools. So, the term that Willis is vilified for by the African American community really is this term neighborhood schools. And all that is his idea, we need to have a school just for the neighborhood, for the people who live in the immediate locale. And in an era of desegregation, again, people from the Chicago Public Defender, the NAACP, and the Urban League largely term this as being a anti-desegregation dog whistle and being a euphemism for wanting to keep things separate. As such, Willis becomes a huge object of vilification. His insistence of not providing adequate building resources for African American schools and giving them many temporary buildings causes a lot of unrest in the community. People start calling all these T buildings the Willis wagons. The Urban League points out that urban schools operate on about 66% the money that white schools do, and because of this, eventually the NAACP and the Chicago Defender become very vocal in organizing sit-ins, boycotts, and mass demonstrations. against the huge resource inequity, or resource distribution inequity, between white schools and black schools. And by 1966, after 13 years, Benjamin Cobbage Willis leaves. So in the post-Willis era, how does Chicago recover? Unfortunately, it doesn't, for the most part. It doesn't revert back to what it was like in the 1940s, early 1950s, this era of the Golden Age. Because there has been such ethnic stratification, because people have already moved and taken their resources, it's very difficult for them to be forced to go back. There's no laws that are passed to undo what was done. And by the 1990s, whites are a minority in the public schools. Most white students are attending private schools. And you have this huge exacerbation between the haves and the have-nots. And neighborhood schools, unfortunately, become the norm. All right. Well, thank you.